The morning sky hung heavy over Portland, thick with November clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Richard Caldwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city wake up beneath him. At 63, he'd built Caldwell Industries from a single hardware store into a logistics empire worth $500 million. But lately, the view from the top felt lonelier than ever. His wife, Elizabeth, had passed away 18 months ago. The grief counselor said the emptiness would fade with time, but Richard found the opposite to be true. The silence in his lakeside mansion grew louder each night. The business meetings felt more hollow. And the people around him, the executives, the board members, even his own adult children, seemed to only appear when they needed something. "Mr. Caldwell, your 9 o'clock is here." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, pulling him from his thoughts. Another meeting. Another day of polite smiles and calculated words. That evening, as Richard's driver pulled up to the building's garage exit, an idea began forming in his mind. Elizabeth used to say that you could tell everything about a person's character by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. She'd volunteered at homeless shelters, tutored immigrant children, remembered the names of every janitor and security guard in every building they'd ever entered. "What are you really worth, Richard?" she'd asked him once, during one of their late-night conversations. "Not in dollars, in kindness, in impact." He hadn't had a good answer then. But maybe he could find one now. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard carefully crafted his plan. He would test his employees, not their competence or their efficiency, but something far more fundamental. He would test their humanity. On a bitter Monday morning in early December, when the frost painted delicate patterns on every window in Portland, Richard Caldwell disappeared. The man who shuffled into the lobby of Caldwell Industries headquarters at 6:47 a.m. looked nothing like the company's founder. Gray stubble covered his jaw. A threadbare wool coat hung from his shoulders, 2 sizes too large. His fingerless gloves were crusted with dirt, and he carried a battered sign that read, "Homeless veteran. Anything helps. God bless." Richard had spent hours perfecting the disguise with a theatrical makeup artist who'd worked on Hollywood films. Prosthetics added wrinkles and age spots. Contact lenses dulled his distinctive green eyes to a watery gray. He'd practiced the shuffling walk, the downcast gaze, the slight tremor in his hands. But the most important part of his disguise was something no makeup could create: invisibility. He needed to become the kind of person others looked through, not at. He positioned himself on the cold concrete just outside the building's main entrance, where the corporate employees would stream past on their way to comfortable offices and catered breakfast meetings. The wind cut through his thin coat. He'd insisted on that, wanting to feel at least a fraction of what real homeless people endured, and he settled in to watch. The first wave arrived at 7 o'clock. Junior associates, eager and ambitious, clutching their coffee cups like lifelines. Their eyes slid past him as if he were part of the architecture. Some stepped slightly wider to avoid getting too close. One young woman actually wrinkled her nose as she passed, though Richard was certain he didn't smell. He'd been very careful about that. "Spare some change?" he mumbled, keeping his voice raspy and defeated. "Just trying to get something warm to eat." Nothing. Not even acknowledgement that he'd spoken. The second wave came at 7:30. Middle management, department heads, people who'd sat in meetings with him, presented quarterly reports, laughed at his jokes over lunch. Patricia Wong from Human Resources walked past, her heels clicking smartly on the concrete. She was on her phone, animated, laughing about her daughter's soccer tournament. "Ma'am, please," Richard tried, reaching out slightly. "I'm so hungry." Patricia's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment, the briefest recognition that he existed, before she turned her shoulder and kept walking, never breaking stride in her conversation. Richard felt something crack in his chest. Patricia had attended Elizabeth's funeral. She'd sent a lovely card with a handwritten note about how much his wife had meant to the company culture. By 8 o'clock, Over 100 employees had passed. Richard had received exactly $3 in change. All from the same person, a maintenance worker named Darius who wasn't even on his list to observe, who'd emptied his entire pocket and said, "It ain't much, brother, but it's what I got." The cold was seeping into Richard's bones now, making them ache in ways he'd never experienced. His feet had gone numb despite 2 pairs of socks. He understood, suddenly and viscerally, why the homeless died from exposure. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the relentless, grinding nature of it, the way it wore you down minute by minute until you couldn't remember what warmth felt like. At 8:15, Thomas Brennan emerged from a black Mercedes, adjusting his Rolex. Thomas was Richard's vice president of operations, a man who'd been with the company for 12 years. He earned $340,000 a year plus bonuses. Richard had personally mentored him, had written recommendation letters for his children's college applications. "Mr. Brennan, sir," Richard said, making his voice stronger, more desperate. "Please, I'm a veteran. I just need help getting a meal." Thomas didn't even slow down. His eyes passed over Richard like he was looking at a trash can. Necessary infrastructure to be avoided, nothing more. By 9 o'clock, Richard had been sitting in the cold for over 2 hours. His test had yielded depressing results. Out of approximately 200 employees who'd entered the building, only 7 had acknowledged his existence in any way, or had given money totaling $11. 3 had offered apologetic smiles but kept walking. Not one of his senior leadership team had paused. Not one of the people he'd made millionaires through stock options and bonuses. Not one person who'd celebrated promotions in his boardroom, who'd toasted champagne at company galas, who'd sent him sympathy cards when Elizabeth died. He was preparing to pack up his sign, his heart heavy with disappointment, when he heard a voice. "Hey, hi there." Richard looked up to see a young woman crouching down to his level, her face open and concerned. She couldn't have been more than 25, with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a modest navy dress and a thin jacket that was clearly insufficient for the weather. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You're shaking pretty badly." Richard recognized her. Nina Reyes, a junior accountant who'd been hired only 8 months ago. She worked in one of the basement offices, the kind of position that was 3 or 4 rungs from the bottom of the corporate ladder. He'd probably seen her name on reports but couldn't recall ever speaking to her directly. "I'm just cold, miss," he said, his voice cracking. Partly from performance, partly from genuine emotion. "Been out here a while." Nina glanced at her watch, then back at him. Richard could see her doing the mental calculation. She was already late, probably for some meeting where her absence would be noted, possibly criticized. "Wait here," she said, standing up. "Don't go anywhere. Okay? Promise me." Before Richard could respond, she hurried into the building. He waited, curious despite himself. She'd probably just wanted to escape an uncomfortable situation politely. In 2 minutes, she'd be at her desk, and he'd be forgotten. But Nina returned. She was carrying a large coffee, steam rising from the cup, and a paper bag that smelled like heaven, warm croissants, if Richard's nose was correct. "Here," she said, kneeling again and pressing both into his hands. The warmth of the coffee cup against his frozen fingers was almost painful. "I know it's not much, but it should help warm you up." Richard stared at the offerings, genuinely overwhelmed. The coffee alone was probably $7 from the fancy place in the lobby. The bag held not 1 but 2 croissants, flaky and golden. "Miss, this is too much," he said. "It's okay," Nina said, smiling. "I'm glad to help." She reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, crisp and new, probably withdrawn for some specific purpose. She tucked it under the coffee cup's cardboard sleeve. "And take this too. Maybe you can find somewhere warm to stay tonight, even if it's just for a few hours." "I can't take your money," Richard protested, his voice thick. "Please," Nina said. and her eyes were so earnest, so genuinely kind, that Richard felt his throat tighten. My mom always taught me that we're supposed to help each other. That's what makes us human, you know? The helping. She stood up, brushing off her knees, and checked her watch again. She was definitely late now. Are you going to be okay? She asked. I don't know. Is there someone I can call for you? A shelter or something? You're going to be late for work, Richard said. Nina shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. Some things are more important than being on time. You take care of yourself, okay? And if you're here tomorrow, I'll bring you something warm again. She walked away, her thin jacket offering little protection against the wind, having just given away her breakfast and probably her lunch money too. Richard sat there for a long moment, the warm coffee cup in his hands, watching her disappear into the building. Then, for the first time since Elizabeth died, he felt something shift in his chest. Not the heavy weight of grief, but something lighter, something like hope. Around him, employees continued streaming past, blind and hurried. But one person had seen him. One person had stopped. That was enough to change everything. Richard didn't go home that night. Instead, he checked into a modest hotel and spent the evening in front of his laptop, diving deep into Nina Reyes's employee file. What he found both humbled and fascinated him. Nina had immigrated from the Philippines when she was 15, following her mother who'd come to the United States 2 years earlier to work as a nurse. She'd put herself through Portland State University while working 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop, one cleaning offices at night. She'd graduated with a 3.8 GPA and a degree in accounting, but with no connections and a resume full of service work, Caldwell Industries was the only company that had offered her an interview. Her starting salary was $42,000 a year, barely enough to live on in Portland. According to her records, she'd taken no sick days in 8 months and had voluntarily worked through 2 weekends during the annual audit crunch, without requesting overtime pay. Her performance reviews from her supervisor, Janet Hardwick, were lukewarm at best. Adequate technical skills, one read, needs to be more assertive and show more initiative. Another noted, tends to spend too much time on minor tasks, should focus on efficiency. But there was a note in her file from Darius, the maintenance worker, the same one who'd given Richard money that morning. Someone had printed out an email he'd sent to HR. I wanted to let someone know that Nina always asks me how I'm doing. She learned my kids' names. Last week when I was sick, she brought me soup from home. Just thought you should know you've got a good one there. Richard leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. Then he picked up his phone and made a call to his head of security. Gerald, it's Richard. I need you to do something for me, and I need complete discretion. Over the next 3 days, Richard returned to his spot outside the building. And each morning, like clockwork, Nina appeared with coffee and food. On Tuesday, she brought him oatmeal and a banana, apologizing that she'd only had time to grab something from the convenience store. But it's important to have fruit, she said seriously. My mom's a nurse, and she's always talking about vitamin C and immune systems. On Wednesday, she brought him a thermos of homemade soup. I made extra last night, she explained. It's chicken tinola, a Filipino recipe. It's really good for when you're cold. On Thursday, she arrived with a men's winter coat folded over her arm. It was used but clean, dark blue and insulated. I found this at Goodwill last night, she said, helping him into it. I hope it fits okay. The nights are getting colder, and I've been worried about you. Each day, Richard watched her disappear into the building, late for work, having spent money she clearly couldn't afford to spare. And each day, his security team reported back on her movements. The picture they painted was remarkable. Nina rented a tiny studio apartment in a rough neighborhood, $8.50 a month, which was cheap for Portland but still ate up a huge portion of her income. She sent $500 every month to her mother in the Philippines, where the money supported not just her mom but two younger siblings still in school. She took the bus everywhere to save on gas. Her grocery receipts showed a diet heavy on rice, beans, and discount produce. Yet somehow she was spending $10 to $15 per day on a homeless stranger. On Wednesday evening, Gerald called Richard with an interesting update. "Boss, you need to hear this. We pulled her work computer logs with her supervisor's permission like you asked. Nina's been staying late every night this week, making up the time she loses in the morning helping you. She's working off the clock so it doesn't show as overtime." "What about her supervisor?" Richard asked. "Has Janet noticed?" "That's the thing," Gerald said, and Richard could hear the anger in his voice. "Janet has noticed. She sent Nina an email yesterday warning her about attendance issues and threatening to write her up. Nina responded apologizing and promising to do better, but she was at your corner again this morning." Richard felt his jaw tighten. "Anything else?" "Yeah. We've been monitoring the break room conversations, standard security footage review. Some of Nina's coworkers have been making fun of her. They saw her helping you through the windows, called her a bleeding heart, and said she's trying too hard to look good. One guy said she's probably just naive and doesn't understand that homeless people will waste it on drugs anyway." Richard closed his eyes. The cruelty was casual, thoughtless, which somehow made it worse. "Keep monitoring," he said. "And Gerald? Tomorrow morning, I want you to have our full executive team assembled in the main conference room at 9:30 a.m. Don't tell them why. Just say it's mandatory." Friday morning was the coldest yet. Richard arrived at his corner at 6:30 a.m., and the temperature was barely above freezing. His breath plumed white in the air, and ice had formed in the cracks of the sidewalk. By 8 o'clock, his body was shaking uncontrollably despite the coat Nina had bought him. This would be his last day of the test. He couldn't sustain it physically, and more importantly, he'd already learned everything he needed to know. Around him, the morning rush continued its predictable flow. Thomas Brennan passed by, this time with his wife, both laughing about something on her phone. They stepped around Richard like he was a puddle to be avoided. Janet Hardwick, Nina's supervisor, walked past with another manager, complaining about having to attend some mysterious mandatory meeting that was disrupting her morning. At 8:20, Richard saw Nina hurrying down the sidewalk, moving faster than usual. She was carrying what looked like a heavy shopping bag, and when she reached him, her face was flushed from the cold and exertion. "Good morning," she said, kneeling down. She was breathing hard. "Okay, so I know it's getting really cold, and I've been worried about you. So..." She opened the bag and began pulling out items. "I got you thermal underwear, they had it on sale at Target. And thick socks, the kind for hiking. And this sleeping bag is rated for 20 degrees, so it should help at night. And there are hand warmers in here, like 20 packets of them." Richard stared at the pile of items, his eyes stinging. The bag must have cost at least $100, probably more. That was a significant portion of her paycheck. "Nina," he said, his voice breaking, "you can't afford this." She looked surprised that he'd used her name. She must have introduced herself earlier in the week, though Richard had been so moved he couldn't recall the exact moment. "It's okay," she said firmly. "I picked up an extra shift at my old coffee shop last weekend. I wanted to make sure you had what you needed." She started helping him unpack the items, showing him how the hand warmers worked, tucking the thermal underwear into his coat pocket. "And I brought breakfast, bacon and egg sandwiches. Still warm." "Why?" Richard asked, the question emerging raw and honest. "Why are you doing this for me? You don't know me. I'm nobody." Nina stopped her busy movements and looked at him directly. Her eyes were very gentle. "You're not nobody," she said quietly. "You're someone. Everyone is someone. Everyone matters." She smiled a little sadly. "When my family first came here, we had nothing. We lived with 6 people in a 2-bedroom apartment. My mom worked terrible hours, and sometimes we didn't have enough food. But people helped us. A teacher paid for my school supplies. A neighbor gave us groceries. Random strangers showed us kindness when they didn't have to. She looked down at her hands. My mom used to say that kindness is like a seed. You plant it and you don't always see it grow, but somewhere it does. It becomes something beautiful. So I'm just planting seeds, I guess, hoping they grow somewhere, for someone. Richard couldn't speak. Tears were rolling down his cheeks now, cutting warm tracks through the dirt of his makeup. Nina noticed and looked alarmed. "Oh no, are you okay? Are you crying?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "You have a meeting," Richard managed to say. "You're going to be late again." Nina checked her watch and winced. "Yeah, I probably am. It's this mandatory thing. Probably some corporate announcement or whatever." She stood up, brushing off her knees. "But listen, if you're still here when I get out, I'll come check on you. Okay? And this weekend, I'm going to research some social services. See if we can get you connected to some programs that might help." She squeezed his shoulder gently, a gesture of such simple human warmth that Richard felt something break open in his chest. And then she was gone, hurrying toward the building entrance. Richard sat there for another moment, then carefully gathered up all the items Nina had brought him. He stood, his joints protesting, and walked slowly toward the building's side entrance, where Gerald was waiting with fresh clothes and a concerned expression. "You look terrible, boss," Gerald said. "I feel terrible," Richard admitted. "But I also feel more alive than I have in years." He handed Gerald the shopping bag full of cold-weather gear. "Make sure this gets donated to the mission on 4th Street. All of it. And include a check for $10,000. "You got it," Gerald said. "Everyone's assembled upstairs. You ready for this?" Richard thought about Nina's words, about seeds and kindness and things growing in unseen places. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." The executive conference room on the 42nd floor was packed. Richard's entire senior leadership team was there. 12 people who collectively earned over $4 million per year. Thomas Brennan sat at the far end, checking his phone. Patricia Wong was chatting with the CFO about a golf tournament. Janet Hardwick looked annoyed, tapping her pen against her notepad. Also present, looking confused and nervous, was Nina Reyes. She sat in a chair against the wall, separate from the executive table, clearly uncertain why she'd been summoned. At exactly 9:30, the door opened, and Richard Caldwell walked in clean, shaved, dressed in his usual impeccable suit. The room went silent. "Thank you all for coming," Richard said, taking his position at the head of the table. His eyes found Nina, who looked utterly baffled. "I'm sure you're all wondering why you're here." "We certainly are," Thomas said with a slightly condescending smile. "Some of us have very full schedules today, Richard." "I'm sure you do," Richard said mildly. "But I promise this won't take long. I wanted to share the results of an experiment I've been conducting this week." He clicked a button on the remote in his hand, and the large screen behind him lit up with a photo. It showed him in his homeless disguise, sitting against the cold concrete outside their building. The room erupted in confused murmurs. "For the past 5 days," Richard continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel, "I've been sitting outside this building disguised as a homeless veteran. I wanted to see how our employees, how the people who work for me, who represent this company, who benefit from its success, would treat someone they perceived as having nothing to offer them." He clicked through a series of photos, time-stamped and clear. Thomas walking past without a glance. Patricia on her phone, actively avoiding eye contact. Janet stepping wide to maintain distance. Over 200 employees passed me during these 5 days. 200 people who work in this building, who earn good salaries, who have health insurance and retirement plans and annual bonuses. Do you know how many stopped to help? The room was silent now, except for the sound of someone's uncomfortable shifting in their seat. 7, Richard said. 7 people acknowledged my existence with more than a passing glance. Forgave me money, totaling $38 over 5 days. 3 offered kind words but nothing else. He paused, letting the weight of that number settle. None of you stopped, he said, looking directly at his executive team. Not one person in this room. Not one person who I've enriched, promoted, mentored, and trusted. Thomas had gone pale. Patricia was staring at her hands. Janet's face was flushed with either embarrassment or anger. Richard couldn't tell which. But one person did help, Richard said, his voice softening. He turned to look at Nina, who had tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth. Nina Reyes, a junior accountant who makes $42,000 a year, stopped every single day. She brought me food, coffee, clothing, and supplies. She spent money she couldn't afford to spend. She was late to work, risking her job to make sure a stranger was okay. He clicked to a new slide, a breakdown of Nina's giving. The numbers were stark against the white screen. Nina spent approximately $167 helping me this week. That represents roughly 4% of her monthly take-home pay. By comparison, Thomas, you earn $340,000 per year. 4% of your monthly income would be around $1,100. You walked past me at least 8 times and didn't give me a penny. Thomas looked like he might be sick. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Richard continued. What matters more is the why. He turned back to Nina, who was shaking her head slightly, overwhelmed. Nina, why did you help me? I just... Nina's voice was barely audible. Everyone deserves kindness. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be seen, Richard repeated. He looked around the room. This young woman, who many of you probably don't even know by name, understood something that apparently needs to be relearned. She understood that our humanity isn't measured by our titles or our salaries. It's measured by what we do when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain, when helping someone costs us something real. He pulled out a piece of paper from his folder. This is an email from Janet Hardwick to Nina, dated 2 days ago. It's a written warning about attendance issues. Nina was late because she was helping me. She made up every minute of that time, working through her lunches and staying late. But she was still threatened with disciplinary action. Janet looked down at the table, her face burning. And this, Richard continued, pulling out more papers, is a collection of break room surveillance transcripts. I won't read them all, but they include Nina being mocked by her coworkers for wasting money on homeless people and trying too hard to look good. Multiple people suggested she was naive. One person said, and I quote, "She'll learn soon enough that you can't save everyone, especially people who don't want to be saved." The room was suffocatingly silent now. Here's what I've learned this week, Richard said, setting down his papers. I've learned that I've built a company full of people who've forgotten what Elizabeth, my late wife, tried to teach all of us. She used to say that success without compassion is just greed with a good PR team. She was right. He walked slowly along the length of the table, making eye contact with each executive. I've made many of you wealthy. I've given you opportunities, advancement, and trust. And when I needed to see if that success had made you better people, more generous, more kind, more aware of your ability to impact others, you failed. Spectacularly. Richard, Thomas started, his voice shaking. If we had known it was you. That's exactly the point. Richard's voice cracked like a whip. If you had known it was me, you would have helped. Because I could do something for you. But a stranger? Someone with nothing to offer? That person was invisible to you. That person didn't matter. He took a breath, steadying himself. Effective immediately, there will be changes at Caldwell Industries. First, every employee will be required to complete 20 hours of community service per quarter. Not because I'm forcing compassion, you can't force that, but because I want people to remember that there's a world outside these walls that needs us. He turned to Janet. Janet, you're being reassigned. You'll no longer supervise junior staff. Someone who threatens to discipline an employee for being kind doesn't deserve to shape our company culture. Janet's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Thomas, Patricia, and the rest of you, consider this your wake-up call. You have 6 months to show me that you understand what this company should stand for. Not just profit, but purpose. Not just success, but significance. If you can't do that, there are plenty of other companies that will value your skills. But they won't be mine. He walked back to the head of the table and turned to face Nina, who was still crying quietly, overwhelmed by everything happening. "Nina," he said gently, "would you please stand up?" She did, shakily, using the wall for support. "You've been here for 8 months," Richard said. "In that time, you've been an adequate employee. I've read your reviews. You're on time with your work, you're accurate, you don't cause problems. But here's what your reviews don't capture. You're kind. You're generous. You see people, really see them, in a world that's increasingly good at looking away." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "My wife always said that character is what you do when no one who matters is watching. Nina, you thought you were helping a homeless veteran who could never repay you. You sacrificed your money, your time, and your professional safety to help a stranger. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to Director of Corporate Social Responsibility, a new position I'm creating. Your salary is now $95,000 per year, with full benefits and an annual bonus tied to the impact of our community programs. You'll report directly to me, and your job is to help this company remember its soul." Nina gasped, her hand going to her chest. "Mr. Caldwell, I can't. I'm not qualified. I don't." "You're the most qualified person in this building," Richard said firmly. "You understand what matters. Everything else can be learned." He handed her the envelope. "Inside, you'll also find a check for $10,000. It's reimbursement for what you spent this week, plus a little extra. I want you to use it however you need. Pay off debt, help your family, save it, spend it. It's yours." Nina took the envelope with trembling hands, tears falling freely now. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help me fix this place," Richard said. "Say you'll help me build a company that Elizabeth would be proud of." "Yes," Nina whispered. "Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you so much." Richard turned back to the room, his eyes sweeping across the faces of his executives. Some ashamed, some defensive, all shocked. "This meeting is adjourned," he said. "But before you go, I want you to think about something. Every person you pass on the street, every janitor in this building, every waitress who serves you lunch, they're all someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. They all matter. And if you can't see that, then all the success in the world won't make you rich where it counts." As people filed out silently, Richard remained behind with Nina, who was clutching the envelope and trying to compose herself. "I'm overwhelmed," she finally said, laughing and crying at the same time. This is life-changing. My mom won't believe it. My siblings can stay in school. I can actually save money. I can." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Why me? Really?" Richard thought about Elizabeth, about her constant campaign to make him see people, not just profits. About the loneliness he'd felt watching the world from his tower office. About the cold concrete and the invisibility and the way Nina had knelt down to meet him at his level. "Because you planted seeds," he said simply. "And it turns out they grew into something beautiful." 6 months later, Caldwell Industries launched the Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation, funded with $50 million from Richard's personal fortune. Nina ran it with the same fierce compassion she'd shown that cold November morning. The foundation provided housing assistance, job training, and mental health services for homeless veterans. Thomas Brennan volunteered at the foundation's job training center every Saturday morning. He never said much about why, but Richard noticed that he'd stopped wearing his Rolex. Patricia Wong started a mentorship program for new immigrants, connecting them with established professionals who could open doors. She told Richard once, quietly, that she'd been an immigrant child herself. She'd just forgotten somewhere along the way. Janet Hardwick left the company. In her exit interview, she admitted she'd become the kind of manager she'd once resented. She took a job at a nonprofit and sent Nina an apology letter that Nina kept in her desk drawer. The cold weather supplies Nina had bought, the coat, the sleeping bag, the hand warmers, all ended up at the Portland Rescue Mission, along with Richard's check for $10,000. The mission director called to thank him personally, saying it would help them serve over 200 people that winter. Darius, the maintenance worker who'd given Richard his pocket change that first morning, received a promotion to facilities manager and a $20,000 raise. "You saw a person who needed help," Richard told him. "That's the kind of leadership this company needs." As for Nina, she transformed the role Richard created for her. Within a year, Caldwell Industries became known not just for its logistics efficiency but for its community impact. Employees competed to participate in volunteer programs. The company culture shifted from cutthroat competition to collaborative compassion. And Richard found himself looking forward to coming to work again. The loneliness that had gripped him since Elizabeth's death began to ease. He started inviting Nina to lunch once a week, not to discuss business but to hear her ideas, her stories, her perspective on the world. "You remind me of her," he told Nina one day over sandwiches in his office, the Portland skyline stretching out behind them. "Elizabeth, you both believed people are basically good. That kindness matters more than success." Nina smiled, the same genuine warmth that had made her kneel down to help a stranger. "Maybe success is kindness," she said. "Maybe that's the whole point." Richard thought about that for a long time after she left. About a 25-year-old accountant who'd seen a homeless man and thought, "Here is someone who needs help." About how that simple act of recognition, of seeing someone when the world looked away, had changed everything. That evening, Richard visited Elizabeth's grave for the first time in months. The cemetery was quiet, the late spring air soft and warm. He sat on the bench near her headstone and told her everything about the test, about Nina, about the changes at the company. "You were right," he said to the carved stone, to the memory of her smile. "It was never about the money. It was about what we do with it, who we become because of it, whether we use it to build walls or bridges." The wind rustled through the trees, and Richard imagined he could hear Elizabeth's voice. "Took you long enough to figure it out," he laughed, wiping his eyes. Then he stood, placed his hand on the sun-warmed stone, and made a promise. He would never forget again, never stop seeing people, never become so successful that he forgot what really mattered. Because in the end, that's what the test had taught him. Not that most people failed, though they had, but that one person passed, and one person was enough to change everything. One person who saw a stranger shivering in the cold and thought, "Here is someone who deserves kindness." One person who understood that we're all just walking each other home, and the least we can do is make the journey a little warmer, a little kinder, a little more full of grace. If you're watching this story and feeling convicted, good. That discomfort is your conscience reminding you of who you're capable of being. Tomorrow you'll have a chance to be that person. To stop, to see, to help. Don't overthink it. Don't wait for the perfect opportunity or the most deserving recipient. Just be kind. The person in front of you, the one everyone else is ignoring, might be your test, or they might be your teacher. Either way, they're your neighbor in this brief, bewildering journey called life. Treat them accordingly, because one day you might be the one who needs help, the one sitting in the cold, the one everyone walks past. And on that day, you'll pray for a Nina Reyes to appear. So be a Nina Reyes today. Plant seeds. Trust they'll grow. And remember, the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money. It's the dignity of being seen. We live in a world that measures worth in dollars, titles, and achievements. But the truest measure of our humanity is invisible to spreadsheets and resumes. It's found in the moment we stop for someone who can't repay us. In the kindness we show when no one is watching. In our willingness to see people, not as they appear to us, but as they are, fellow travelers in this brief and precious life, each carrying their own struggles, each deserving of dignity and compassion. Success can be built and broken, earned and lost. But character, true character, is forged in the small moments when we choose to help instead of hurry past. When we give from our little instead of hoarding our plenty. When we recognize that the person we ignore today might be the one who teaches us tomorrow what it really means to be rich. Nina Reyes didn't know she was planting a seed that November morning. She just knew someone was cold and hungry, and she had the power to change that. She didn't calculate the return on investment or wonder if her kindness would be noticed. She simply did what her heart told her was right. And that's the lesson Richard Caldwell learned sitting on that frozen concrete. The world doesn't need more successful people. It needs more kind ones. It needs people who will stop, who will see, who will sacrifice something real, time, money, comfort because another human being matters. Every day we walk past opportunities to change someone's life. Most of us don't recognize them because we're looking for grand gestures, dramatic moments, life or death scenarios. But transformation usually comes wrapped in ordinary paper. It looks like a cup of coffee offered to cold hands, a sandwich shared with a stranger, $20 tucked into a worn coat pocket. It looks like kindness, plain and simple. And kindness, as Nina's mother said, is a seed. We plant it without knowing where it will grow or what it will become. We plant it because planting is what keeps us human in a world that too often forgets humanity. So the question isn't whether you're rich or poor, powerful or powerless, successful or struggling. The question is simpler and more profound. When you see someone who needs help, do you stop? Do you really see them as a person who matters? Because in that moment, you're not just helping them. You're helping yourself remember what you're here for, why any of this matters, what it means to be alive. Richard tested his employees and found one person who passed. But in truth, Nina tested Richard too. Tested his capacity to recognize genuine character, to humble himself before wisdom that wore no crown, to learn from someone the world had overlooked. They both passed. And in their passing, they both discovered what Elizabeth had known all along. That kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing we have. It's the seed that grows into forests, the spark that lights 1,000 candles, the small act that echoes into eternity. We are all wandering through this world carrying gifts we didn't earn and burdens we didn't choose. Some of us sleep in mansions. Some of us sleep in doorways, but we all need the same thing, to be seen, to be valued, to be reminded that we're not alone in the darkness. You have the power to give that to someone today. Maybe it's a person holding a sign on a street corner. Maybe it's a coworker everyone overlooks. Maybe it's the cashier who rings up your groceries or the janitor who empties your trash. They're not invisible. They never were. But they need you to prove it. To stop for just a moment and treat them like they matter, because they do. Richard Caldwell learned that lesson the hard way. He had to disguise himself as powerless to understand what power really means. He had to sit in the cold to appreciate warmth. He had to be ignored by hundreds to recognize the value of one person who stopped. You don't need to run that experiment. You already know the truth in your heart. The question is, what will you do with it? Tomorrow morning, someone will cross your path who needs kindness. Will you see them? Will you stop? Will you plant the seed? Because somewhere, in ways you'll never know, that seed will grow. And the harvest is more beautiful than you can possibly imagine.